The wind coming off the ridge had a bite to it when I first heard the noise, not the usual scrape of barn doors or the creak of cottonwoods, but voices carrying low and mean from behind the general store. I stepped out from the stable yard, dust and frost crunching under my boots, and saw men crowding in tight around a splintered platform. On it stood a young woman barefoot in the frozen dirt, her long black hair tangled and falling over a torn deerskin dress. Her gray eyes stared past everyone, empty of light. The rope around her wrist hung loose, but she didn't move. The laughter from the men carried sharper than the wind, and for a moment I just stood there, deciding whether to walk away or step closer. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're listening from in the comments, and tap like and subscribe if you've ever stood at a crossroads where one choice could change everything. My name's Wade Coulter. I was born in a sod house my father raised by hand, out past where the creek bends and the grass runs to sagebrush. We didn't have much, but we kept the Sabbath, told the truth, and worked until the light failed. My mother believed a man's worth showed in how he treated his neighbors, and my father believed in paying what you owed before you bought what you wanted. Those lessons stuck with me even after I came back from the war with a scar in my side, and more quiet in me than talk. After my wife died in childbirth 3 winters ago, the house on the ridge turned into a place for chores and sleep, nothing more. I kept the fences mended, the stock fed, and the fire going just enough to keep the frost from splitting the boards. Trips into town were rare. A sack of grain, a box of nails, maybe a visit to the smith if a shoe came loose. Bitter Dusk Gulch had grown since I was a boy. The railroad spur brought in money gamblers and men who measured worth by the weight of their coin rather than the calluses on their hands. Land speculators bought up empty lots, and saloon talk often carried more power than the county judge. I never minded keeping apart from that, but distance doesn't keep trouble from finding you. That morning I'd come in for feed in a horseshoe and found myself on the edge of a crowd, watching a man try to sell another human being as if she were a broken tool to be rid of. No one called her by name. No one offered her a coat or shoes. The auctioneer smirked and spoke over the jeers, and the girl stood there without flinching. I didn't know, her didn't know where she'd come from, and I couldn't say why my boots carried me forward instead of away. But as the wind pushed cold through my coat and the men's laughter rolled like smoke through the square, I knew one thing before I left that place. Something about my life was going to change. The square behind the general store smelled of wet wood and livestock. The ground packed hard from boot heels and wagon wheels. A rope stretched from the corner post to the platform where the girl stood. Her bare feet were planted in the frost-dark dirt toes still against the cold. Her hair, black and tangled, hung uneven to her shoulders, brushing the torn fringe of a deerskin dress. She did not lift her head when the auctioneer barked to the crowd, and the rope slackened in his hand when he stepped back from her. I moved forward through the ring of men until I was close enough to see the pale shade of her eyes. They fixed on nothing, not shifting at the sound of jeers or the shuffle of boots. Her hand stayed loose at her sides. I pulled a leather pouch from my coat and let $5 silver fall into the dirt by the auctioneer's feet. His brow rose, but he bent to scoop the coins. "Yours," he said, quick as that. The rope came free under my hand, and I felt the faint flinch in her arm before she steadied. I set my palm under her elbow, light enough to guide, and led her down the platform steps. The crowd parted with mutters trailing after us, some sharp, some low, with laughter. We passed the stables and the saloon porch, heading for the ridge trail that cut away from town. Her steps matched mine without question, though she had no way of knowing where we were bound. The trail was little more than wagon ruts through red dust and cactus flats. Dusk settled in as we climbed toward the hills, the wind picking up dry and cold. I'd tied an old wool blanket over her shoulders, drawing the torn dress in close without touching more than her arm. She rode behind me on my gelding, her legs to one side, arms folded to keep the warmth in. She didn't ask to stop, didn't ask anything at all. By the time we reached the rim of the canyon, night had dropped full. My cabin stood where the ridge curved in cottonwoods and brush cutting the wind. No smoke had come from the chimney in 2 days, and the boards creaked when I opened the door. The air inside was colder than the night. I struck a match at the stove, the hiss of kindling filling the room. Firelight showed the narrow table, 2 chairs, shelves of tinware and sacks, and the 2 closed doors at the far wall. I pointed to one. "That's yours," I said. She tilted her head, listening, then stepped toward it without a word. She didn't move far from the doorway until I set a blanket on her shoulders again. Her bare feet made no sound on the plank floor as she found the table by touch and took the chair nearest the fire. I ladled beans into a tin plate, added a strip of dried venison and bread, and set it within her reach. She found the edge of the plate with her fingertips, measuring each bite before bringing it to her mouth. I sat across from her, watching the way her head angled slightly toward each sound, the crack of the logs, the groan of the roof in the wind. When she'd finished, she carried the plate to the basin, her fingers trailing along the counter until she found the edge. She stood a moment by the stove, the firelight warming her face, before stepping into the room I'd given her. I heard the soft scrape of her hand along the wall, the slow count of her steps, and then the creak of the bed. At first light, I found the cabin warmer than I'd left it. Fresh ash lay in the stove, and the kettle was half full. She was pacing the main room, one hand on the wall, counting the steps from hearth to table and back. She paused at each corner, tapping with her toe, then moved on. Her hair caught the light from the fire as she turned the blanket trailing from her shoulders. Later, she found the broom behind the door, testing its handle with her foot before sweeping in careful lines. She moved in silence, only the bristles whispering against the floor. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching her through the open door. She wasn't just waiting out the hours, she was learning the shape of this place. When I went to the barn, she followed the sound of my boots, keeping one hand to the wall outside. I told her, "Too far," and she stopped, turning back toward my voice. She stepped carefully to the door without taking my hand. That night, I left a basin of warm water and a clean cloth on her bed. She never asked for help, and I never offered more than was needed. The next morning, she was up before me again. I heard the sweep of the broom, the rattle of grain in the chicken yard. She moved along the same path as the day before, hands steady as she scattered feed. In the corner, she found the old stone mill and began grinding grain in slow circles, the sound even and sure. I stood near the window, listening to it fill the quiet. By supper, she had baked flatbread over the hearth fire. The torn dress still hung on her, the edges frayed worse with each day. After we ate, I brought out a length of brown cotton, a needle, and heavy thread. I cut and stitched at the table while she worked the fire, her head tilting now and then at the sound of the scissors or the pull of the thread. When the dress was done, I held it out. She stepped forward, touching the cloth with her fingertips, tracing the seams. She nodded once, then took it into her room. When she came back, it hung loose, but covered her, well, the sleeves long, the collar high. Her hair was braided tighter, and she stood straight as she asked, "You sewed this?" I said yes, and she stepped close enough to lay her palm flat against my chest for a moment before returning to the fire. That night we sat by the hearth in the same chairs, the bread between us. Outside, the snow began to fall soft and steady, and the coyotes called somewhere down the ridge. Her knee touched the edge of my boot, and neither of us moved away. The fire hissed as it settled, and in that stillness, the distance between us felt narrower than it had since we met. By the end of that first week, the snow had eased, leaving the ground soft and the air damp with the smell of thawing earth. Taya no longer trailed her hand along the wall inside the cabin. She moved from stove to table to door, without hesitation. Each turn counted by memory and the sound of her own steps. Outside, she followed the same path from porch to chicken yard, scattering feed with the same measured care she'd used the first morning, only now she did it faster, surer. I began to show her the work that filled my days. In the barn, I laid the tack out on a low bench, guiding her hands to each piece. "Rein," I said, letting her trace the length of leather. "Bit cinch stirrup." She repeated the words once, feeling each one until it made sense without sight. She leaned close to smell the worn leather, the faint tang of metal, the dust in the stitching. When I set a shovel in her grip and pointed her toward a stall, she tested the floor with her boot, found her stance, and worked steadily until the bedding was fresh. She returned the shovel to its place without being told. I found myself watching longer than I meant to, noting the way her shoulders had squared in just a few days, the way her chin stayed level, even when she was listening instead of looking. At supper, she rolled her sleeves up past the elbow, her forearms dusted with hay chaff. The brown cotton dress I'd made hung easier on her, now cinched snug at the waist with a plain cord. The next morning, we walked to the lower fence line. The snowmelt had left the ground slick, but she kept her footing, counting steps and shifting her weight when the earth grew soft under her boots. I carried the coil of barbed wire, and when we reached the post, I told her what it was. She nodded once. I placed her hands gently on the wire, showing her where the tension ran and where the staples bit into wood. She worked, slow testing each section before moving to the next. When we stopped to rest, she faced into the wind, letting it lift the loose ends of her braid. "Why do you do this alone?" she asked. Her voice was calm, not prying. I told her my wife had died 3 winters ago during birth. I hadn't been ready to be around people again. She didn't answer, just turned her face toward my voice and stood there a moment before taking up the wire again. That evening, she helped with more than bread. I showed her how to cut meat with a bone-handled knife, guiding her fingers on the hilt until her grip was right. She worked near the stove, the heat brushing her face, her movements deliberate. Once our hands brushed and neither of us pulled back. We didn't speak about it, but the space between us felt different after that. A week later, I had to ride into town for feed. The main street was busier than usual, men standing in loose knots near the stables. I heard a ranch hand from the southern ridge make a remark about that blind Apache girl staying up at my place. His voice carried just far enough for me to catch the tone. I didn't answer him with words. When I left, he was on the ground spitting blood and a tooth into the dirt. By the time I rode back, the sun was low, streaking the ridge in orange light. Taya was sitting on the porch, her face turned to the breeze. She didn't ask what had happened in town, and I didn't tell her. I set the feed sacks by the wall and sat beside her, letting my arm rest across the back of the bench until my hand brushed her shoulder. She leaned into it without hesitation. The days grew longer, the air softer. I rose before the sun, and now there were always 2 sets of boot prints in the yard, mine and hers. She had memorized every inch of the place, indoors and out. If I shifted a chair or left a tool in a new spot, her hand would find it first, the change noted without a word. I'd sewn her another dress by then, lighter and easier for work. The collar sat lower than the first, not by design, but from the way the fabric settled. She wore it without fuss, and I caught myself watching her, more than I meant to. One day, after a light rain, I came in from mending the barn door to find her kneeling by the fire. Her dress hung from a peg, dripping slowly, and she wore only her underclothes, the fabric clinging damp across her shoulders and waist. She didn't move when I stepped inside. "It's all right," she said, her voice even. "I can't see you, but I know when you're looking." I told her I knew, and she stepped closer until the rain scent from her skin carried between us. "I don't owe you," she said. I told her I hadn't brought her here for that. Her hand found the collar of my shirt, fingertips brushing the buttons. "That's why I want to." She touched my cheek, tracing the line of my jaw before leaning in. Her lips met mine in a slow, sure kiss, and I returned it, my hands at her waist and back. She pressed close, the warmth of her steady against me. I pulled back, first afraid I might not stop. She stayed close enough that her breath touched my cheek. "I see you," she whispered. I told her I saw her too. She smiled faintly and stepped away, leaving her dressed near the hearth. The next morning the fire was still burning low when I woke. Her door was closed, and when I stepped inside, she was curled on her side, her brow drawn. She said her ribs ached, the pain worse than the night before. Her skin was warm under my hand, too warm. I heated water-steeped willow bark and laid a warm compress at her side. She didn't flinch, only breathed shallow. I stayed with her through the day, keeping cloths cool on her forehead and helping her drink from a tin cup. That night, she whispered my name in the dark. I told her I was there, and she asked if I was always this steady. "Not always," I said, "but with you, yes." Her hand found my chest, resting where my heart beat. She fell asleep like that, curled into my side. By morning, the fever had broken. She smiled faintly, said she would stay, and I told her I already knew. The morning after her fever broke, the sky was pale with thin clouds, and the air carried that stillness that comes before a change in weather. Taya moved more carefully than usual, her hand brushing the doorframe before she stepped outside. She stood on the porch a moment, tilting her head toward the sound of the chickens. I set down the bridle I'd been oiling and offered her my arm, but she shook her head, walking the familiar path to the yard on her own. By midday, she was at the wash basin, sleeves rolled, working a bar of lye soap against the fabric of her dress. The steam from the kettle fogged the window above her, and the scent of wet cotton and ash filled the cabin. I split kindling near the hearth and caught her glancing toward the sound of my knife tapping the block. She didn't ask for help, and I didn't offer unless she asked. That evening, she wore the lighter dress I'd sewn a week before, her hair down past her shoulders, damp from the wash. After supper, she crossed the room without feeling for the furniture, her steps sure, and stopped in front of me. She touched my face, her fingers tracing my jaw, then leaned in. The kiss was unhurried, steady, her hands resting against my chest. This time, neither of us stepped back. The days that followed brought a rhythm I hadn't known in years. We worked side by side, she grinding grain at the stone mill, while I mended harness or shelling corn on the porch, while I repaired a saddle strap. In the mornings, she fed the chickens and swept the porch before I finished checking the corral. At night, we sat by the fire, her fingers finding mine without looking. A week later, word came up the ridge before sunrise. A rider from the north pulled his lathered horse in front of the cabin. Breath steaming in the cold air, his coat was torn and his cheek carried a fresh scrape. "Raiders," he said, voice rough, 5 miles out. Took stock from Grady's place, headed this way. I stepped inside, loading both rifles and checking my Colt. "You don't owe them," Taya said from the doorway. I glanced at her braid over one shoulder. Hands at her sides. "No," I said, "but it's not about owing." She took a slow step toward me, barefoot on the plank floor. "Be careful." I nodded, kissed her forehead, and stepped past the rider to the barn. In town, men stood in clusters behind overturned wagons and feed crates. There was no sign of Sheriff Dobson, and the deputies were too green to take charge. I told 2 men to cover the stable windows, another to hold the alley between the mercantile and the smithy. When the first shots cracked from the far end of the street, I was already moving. The fight lasted minutes that felt longer. The raiders rode hard, firing wild. I dropped one with the first shot, another with the second. A third bullet tore across my ribs, a fourth through the upper arm. I kept low, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air. When the last of them turned tail, 2 townsmen lay dead, and the dust in the street was mixed with blood. I stayed on my feet long enough to see the others lowering their rifles. Then the strength left me, and I hit the ground. The sky spun overhead, the sound of boots rushing past, fading into nothing. When I didn't return by nightfall, Taya knew something had gone wrong. The distance to town was 15 miles, the trail rough and unmarked in places. She tied her hair back, pulled on her boots, and packed bread and a water skin. No weapon, she couldn't use one. She stepped off the porch into the dark. She followed the land by sound and feel, the slope of the ridge, the crunch of gravel under her boots, the smell of mesquite where the path split toward the river. More than once she paused, listening to the night before moving on. Once something moved in the grass near her ankle. She froze until it passed. Twice she stumbled, skinning her hand on rock, then pushed forward. By dawn her boots were wet with dew, her legs aching. Near midday she heard wagon wheels and shouted for them to stop. A soldier leaned from the seat, staring at her dirt-streaked face, the gray eyes that didn't focus. "My husband," she said, breath quick. "Bitter Dust Gulch. He's hurt, saved the town." He blinked, then helped her up. "You're blind," he said. "Yes. But I found you, didn't I?" They reached town at sundown. The church had been turned into a place for the wounded. Wade Coulter lay on a cot near the altar shirt, dark with blood. Someone had tied a bandage around his ribs, but the stain had spread. Taya walked straight to him, knelt beside the cot, and took his hand. His eyes opened slow. "You found me," he whispered. "Always," would she said, pressing her forehead to his. The church smelled of lamp oil and damp wood, the air heavy with the quiet murmur of men moving supplies. Wade lay pale against the white pillowcase, his shirt cut open, the bandages around his ribs dark with blood. His eyes were half closed, but when I took his hand, his grip tightened. "Still here," he rasped. I told him I hadn't left. There was no doctor worth trusting. Dobson's deputies said the only medic in town was drunk in the back of the saloon. I found Wade's saddlebag under a bench, the leather damp from the ride, and felt inside for the herbs he kept. Someone had tried to wrap his wounds, but the cloth was tied too loose. I undid it, set it aside, and worked by the feel of the torn muscle, the warmth of his skin, and the steady beat of his pulse. I boiled water on the small stove at the back of the church, crushed the roots with the heel of my hand, and mixed them into a thick poultice. The men kept their distance, their boots scuffing softly on the boards. I pressed the warm mixture to his side, listening to his breath catch before it settled. Between changes of the compress, I made him drink water, in slow sips, one hand at the back of his neck to steady him. The hours passed without measure. The lantern light dimmed, and the shadows lengthened along the pews. When his fever rose, I cooled his forehead with damp cloths, shifting them as the heat soaked through. Once near midnight, he stirred enough to say my name. I told him to rest. By the second day, his breathing was easier, though he drifted in and out of sleep. The townsfolk began to watch from the doorway, their voices low. I heard none of the sharp laughter from before, none of the remarks they'd thrown the day he'd brought me through the main street. Now they just watched, as I worked my hands steady, my ears tuned to each change in his breathing. On the morning of the fourth day, Wade's eyes stayed open. His voice was rough, but clear enough to say, "Didn't think you'd come for me." I told him I always would. He tried to sit, failed, and lay back with a faint smile. "You're my home," he said, his fingers curling around mine. That afternoon, Sheriff Dobson returned. He stepped into the church, his spurs dull against the floor, and asked Wade to serve as acting marshal until the town steadied. Wade refused without hesitation, saying he had no wish for a badge or the work that came with it. We would be leaving as soon as he was able to ride. The next morning, Wade leaned on me as we stepped into the street. The air was sharp with the smell of dust and burnt wood from the raiders' fire. Folks stood along the boardwalk, silent as we passed. In the middle of the square, Wade stopped. He took my hand and raised it high enough for all to see. Not a sound came from the crowd. We left town slow, the horses picking their way over the uneven ground beyond the last fence line. I rode behind him, my arms around his waist to steady him when the trail dipped or the wind pressed too hard. The cabin looked the same when it came into view. The porch boards weathered, the fence half mended. But when we stepped inside, it didn't feel as it had before. I lit the stove while Wade sat at the table, his eyes following the sound of my steps. I unpacked the cloth he'd bought for winter shirts and set it aside. "You know this place better than I do now," he said. I told him I'd memorized it. He leaned back, letting out a slow breath. "You want to stay?" I stepped closer until I stood in front of him. "I told you before," I said. "You're my home." He looked up at me, the light from the stove catching the edge of his face. "I don't have much," he said. "You gave me everything." I answered, "A room, a name, a reason to stay alive." He took my hands, pulling me gently into his lap, his arms around my waist. My fingers traced the lines of his face, the places where the years and the weather had left their mark. His voice was steady when he said, "I want to marry you, not because I owe you, not because you saved me, but because I love you." I cupped his face and told him I'd always seen him. Outside, the wind swept along the ridge, brushing the bare limbs of the cottonwoods. Inside, the fire settled into a deep, even burn, and for the first time since the ride into town, the cabin felt warm, clear through. Spring came slow to the ridge, the snow melting in thin rivulets that cut through the packed earth. Wade's strength returned in steady measures. By the second week home, he was mending fence lines again, though I stayed close, passing tools or holding wire when his arm tired. We worked in the quiet we both knew, only breaking it for the sound of a post settling into place or the rasp of a staple driven home. Inside the cabin, I kept the stove going from dawn to nightfall. Wade had bought more cloth than I could use in a season, and I set to work cutting patterns for shirts and trousers. He would read from the paper or an old book while I sewed, his voice low and even. Sometimes when he paused, my hand would find his, and he'd keep reading without missing a word. One afternoon, we walked to the edge of the ridge where the land dropped toward the lower pasture. The wind carried the scent of mesquite and the sound of the creek far below. Wade stood with his hands in his pockets, looking out over the stretch of grass that was just turning green. "Thinking of putting in a garden this year," he said. I told him I could tend it. By early April, we had staked out a patch near the cabin where the ground got good sunlight. Wade turned the soil while I broke clumps apart with my hands, lining out rows for beans, corn, and squash. My palms were raw by evening, but I didn't mind. We finished just as the sun slid behind the ridge, the air cooling quick enough for us to see our breath. The days settled into a pattern: mornings in the garden or with the animals, afternoons repairing what winter had worn down, evenings by the fire. Wade built a small pen for the hens, hammering the posts, while I held them steady. I learned the sound of each board underfoot and could walk the fence line without stumbling. One Sunday, Wade came back from town with a small paper-wrapped bundle. He set it on the table and nodded for me to open it. Inside was a simple silver band, smooth and cool in my hand. "Cut it from one of the coins I paid for you," he said quietly. My fingers closed around it, and I slid it on without a word. The ring fit as though it had always been mine. That night I braided my hair loose over one shoulder, and we sat close on the bench by the fire. Wade's arm rested along the back, his hand just brushing my shoulder. We stayed like that until the logs burned low. As the weeks passed, I found myself moving with more ease than I had in years. I could tell where Wade was in the room by the sound of his breathing, the way the floor creaked under his step, or the faint scent of leather and smoke on his coat. He no longer warned me about the uneven ground outside. He knew I had it in my head. By May, the garden had sprouted in neat lines and the hens were laying regular. Wade built a second room off the north end of the cabin, the sound of his hammer carrying through the walls each day. When I asked what it was for, he just said, "You'll see." The air warmed, the days lengthened, and we started taking our supper on the porch. Sometimes the wind would shift, carrying faint sounds from the valley hooves on hard ground, a wagon on the trail. But most evenings were quiet. One of those nights, as the sun fell behind the hills, Wade leaned back in his chair and said, "Feels different this year, like the land's holding its breath." I didn't ask what he meant. I could feel it too, the way the stillness had weight to it, as if something was waiting beyond the ridge. It was near the end of the month when the first sign came. A rider appeared on the trail at dusk, the shape of him, just a shadow against the last of the light. He slowed as he neared the cabin, dust rising around the hooves, and tipped his hat toward the porch. "Evening," he called. "Got a message from town." The rider swung down from his horse, dust settling around his boots. He pulled a folded sheet from inside his coat and handed it to Wade. "Came from Sheriff Halpern," he said. "Said it's for you both." Wade thanked him and slipped a coin into his hand before the man turned back to the trail. Inside, the lamplight caught the seal on the paper, dark red wax pressed with the county's mark. Wade broke it open, his brow tightening as he read. He passed it to me, and I traced the words with my fingers as he spoke them aloud. The letter called for us to appear in town in 3 days' time. It mentioned a land dispute, our names listed alongside a rancher I had never met, Elias Behringer. Wade's jaw worked as he folded the letter again. "Behringer's place sits west of here, past Cottonwood Gulch," he said. "He's got money enough to hire lawyers and the will to push anyone off ground he thinks he can take." The next morning, Wade hitched the wagon. We left before sunrise, following the rutted trail toward town. The air was cool, but the sun rose sharp behind us, turning the sagebrush silver. We passed a freighter's wagon, heading east, the driver lifting a hand in greeting, his mules plodding steady. By mid-afternoon, the rooftops of town came into view. The main street was busier than I'd ever heard it, boots on boardwalks, the ring of a hammer from the blacksmith, a wagon wheel creaking as it turned. Wade guided the team to a stop outside the sheriff's office. Sheriff Halpern stepped out, his hat pulled low against the sun. He was a tall man in his 50s, with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to measure every word before speaking. "Wade. Miss." He tipped his hat toward me. "Figured you'd want to hear this in person." Inside, the air smelled of paper and lamp oil. Halpern spread out a map on his desk, pointing to the ridge where our cabin sat. "Behringer claims his deed runs past the gulch right onto your north pasture," he said. "He's filed with the county judge to have it settled." Wade's hands rested on the edge of the desk. "That land's mine. Bought and paid for fair from the Dawson estate 6 years back." The sheriff nodded. "I've seen your deed. But Behringer's got a surveyor's chart saying otherwise. Judge Harlan's riding circuit, he'll be here come Friday to hear it." We left the office with the weight of it pressing between us. Wade suggested we see Mr. Keating, the town's solicitor. His office sat above the mercantile, and he greeted Wade like an old acquaintance. Papers were laid out, questions asked, and Wade answered each in turn. I listened to the rustle of parchment, the scratch of a pen as Keating copied dates and names. When we stepped back into the street, the shadows were long. We stayed the night at the boarding house, the room small but clean, the window opening to the scent of wood smoke from a nearby chimney. Wade sat at the table, the letter from Halpern folded beside him. "Behringer's not just after land," he said quietly. "That ridge holds the only year-round water for 10 miles. Morning came with a low sky, clouds moving in from the west. We walked to the courthouse early, the boardwalk damp from a night rain. Inside, the benches filled quick ranchers, townsfolk, and a few I didn't recognize. Judge Harlan entered, his black coat sweeping the floor as he took the bench. Behringer was there, a broad man with a trimmed beard and a suit that looked fresh from the tailor. His eyes moved over me once before settling on Wade. He nodded, but there was no friendliness in it. The hearing began with the judge reading from each deed. Wade stood straight, answering when asked, his voice steady. Keating laid out the Dawson estate sale, producing receipts, witness statements, and the original map. Behringer's lawyer countered with the surveyor's report pointing to lines and measurements on a chart that showed the ridge under his client's claim. Hours passed in that room, the air growing close. Outside, the clouds broke, sending a shaft of light through the high window to fall across the judge's desk. When at last Harlan spoke, his words were careful. He would need to review both claims in full before ruling. We stepped out into the sunlight, the street quieter now. Wade's hand brushed mine as we walked toward the boarding house. "This isn't done," he said. His voice carried no fear, only the same steady resolve I'd heard when he first read Halpern's letter. That evening, we sat by the window, the lamp casting a soft glow on the table. Wade unfolded a fresh sheet of paper and began writing the pen, moving in even strokes. He paused only once to glance toward me. "If this goes the way Behringer wants," he said, "we'll need every friend and every truth we can find." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of hooves on the hard-packed street. Somewhere in the dark, a rider was making his way toward town. The hoofbeats drew closer, through the dark street, stopping just short of the boarding house porch. A knock came quick and firm. Wade opened the door to find Sheriff Halpern standing there, his coat damp from night air. "Judge Harlan's made his decision," the sheriff said. "He asked me to bring it to you straight." He stepped inside, handed Wade a folded paper, and waited as we gathered near the lamp. Wade read it once, then again, slower. Harlan had ruled in our favor. The ridge, the pasture, and the water rights were ours by law. Behringer's claim was dismissed in full. Relief came quiet, not in a shout, but in the way Wade's shoulders eased and his eyes found mine. The sheriff tipped his hat before leaving. "Best to head home come morning," he said. "Some men take losing harder than others." At first light, we hitched the wagon. The trail home felt different, though the ruts and bends were the same. The cottonwoods shimmered in a light breeze, and the air carried the sharp scent of wet earth. When our cabin came into view, the sight of it struck me deep. The ridge rose behind it, steady and sure, the sun warming its slopes. Wade halted the team just long enough to take it in before we drove on. Inside, the hearth was cold, but the walls held the quiet comfort of a place fought for and won. Wade set the folded judgment on the mantel, its seal catching the light. "This stays here," he said. "Reminds us what's ours." The days that followed were filled with the ordinary work of living, mending a fence line, hauling water, tending stock. But there was a new steadiness in each task. Neighbors came by, some to offer congratulations, others to share word that Behringer had already moved on to other ventures. One evening we sat on the porch as the last light faded over the ridge. The land stretched wide and open before us, the same as it had the day we first came, yet it felt more ours than ever. Out here, a person learns that holding on to what's rightfully theirs often means standing through the hardest weather, be it dust storm or the designs of another. And sometimes, justice comes not in the roar of victory, but in the quiet return to a home left standing. If you've ever held fast through your own trials, I reckon you know the worth of such a moment. And if you haven't yet, I hope you'll remember, steadiness can be its own kind of strength.